How many were here for 4 o'clock Mass on Christmas Eve? They did a great job, and you're still doing it, so thank you. There you go, that's right. You got it. Well, good morning again, everyone. I hope you're all enjoying your Christmas season. Okay. Deacon Paul just stepped out for a bit. He was not feeling well, so he's going to take a little break. So we'll just keep him in our prayers. But I think he's just going to go over to the rectory for a little bit. You know, preachers have a lot of fun with today's story of finding Jesus in the temple. If you attended our outdoor revival in October, you'll remember that the revivalist, Father Anthony Bozeman, made a big deal over how different his mother would have responded had he slipped away for a few days.
They lost Jesus. They were going back to, they started looking for him. They realized he was not there, and he wasn't in the caravan, and they thought he was with relatives. They searched for 3 days. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said, "Son, why have you done this to us?" "Your father and I have been looking for you with great anxiety." Looking for you with great anxiety. A black mother? What in the world wrong with you? Why don't you let me looking all over the place for you? You are crazy. What's wrong with you? You get on my nerves. You must be out of your ever.
There was lots of screaming and shouting and whipping, if I remember correctly. I also once heard a priest refer to this passage as the story of the delinquent parents, because Mary and Joseph left Jerusalem without realizing that Jesus wasn't with them. Well, to be honest, I was so stunned to hear them characterize Mary and Joseph that way that I don't even remember what the preacher's ultimate point was. In fact, I'm not really sure I remember what Father Bozeman's point was either. But how about if we just try taking a little different tact with the story today? And we'll see if you can remember what my point is. So we're looking at St. Luke's Gospel, chapter 2. It begins at verse 41. And St. Luke tells us, "Each year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the feast of Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up according to festival custom." Now, the first thing we learned from that is that Mary and Joseph are observant Jews, and very faithfully observant, because while Passover was a pilgrimage feast, which meant that people would travel to Jerusalem to celebrate it there, it wasn't a requirement that you do so. So the fact that Mary and Joseph have chosen to go to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover shows that they are particularly observant. And the fact that they take Jesus with them also shows that it's important to them to teach their children the faith, to pass that on to Jesus, not only by teaching him, but by bringing him along so that he observes the ritual customs. Much the way that we continue to expect parents to share the faith with their children. Parents, we say, are the first teachers of the faith. Now, the fact that Jesus is 12 years old sparks a lot of debate over the significance of that age. We know today, for example, that a Jewish boy becomes a young man at the age of 13 when he makes his bar mitzvah. And contemporary synagogues today now extend that to girls who, when they become 13, make their bat mitzvah. And the significance of the bar mitzvah and the bat mitzvah is that is when the young person accepts the faith for themselves and then subjects themselves to the law, so that their parents are no longer responsible for making sure they abide by the laws of the faith, but that they do so themselves. And that functions very much the same way our sacrament of confirmation works. We wait until a young person is old enough where they can profess and accept our faith for themselves, and they accept the responsibility from then on to follow the faith themselves. So, if that's the case, Jesus is just before the age of bar mitzvah. So he's not yet fully an adult, so to speak, in the faith. The problem is, though, that we don't really know what the practices were 2,000 years ago. So we don't know when young boys would have made their bar mitzvah at that time. So some scholars have said that they think the significance of him being 12 years old was that because that's just kind of the age and that time between boyhood and adulthood. And that may have made a significance as to who Jesus would have traveled with in the caravan that went to and from Jerusalem. What typically would happen is that the men would go first and make sure the trail was safe and everything, and they would set up camp, and then the women and children would follow. So if Jesus were still a child, he would have been traveling with the women, with Mary. But if he was an adult, he would have been traveling with Joseph. And some scholars think this is what accounts for the mix-up as to where Jesus is. Perhaps Mary thought he was with the men, and Joseph thought he was with the women. The only problem is that we're not sure that that's how they actually traveled in Jesus' day. We know they did that well before Jesus' day, but by the first century, we're not sure at all that groups traveled as men and women. So that could have gotten Joseph and Mary off the hook, but we're not really sure. It seems to me, though, that the significance of him being 12 is that he is at the age of catechesis, which means he's old enough to learn. Okay, so we have catechesis of our young people from the time they're in preschool, but really we expect them to be really understanding and learning the faith as they approach middle school and high school. And if Jesus is 12, well, he would have, what's that, put him in the 7th grade? Yeah, 7th grade, guys, you all listening here? Yep, Jesus in the 7th grade, which we know is a very happy time in a child's life. So if you look at it from that way, I think St. Luke is having a lot of fun with this story, because what he's saying is that the child who is at the age of catechesis, the age of learning, he turns out to be the one who does the teaching. And that's the significance in the story, that he's the teacher of the faith, even though everyone would expect him to be learning the faith. Now, St. Luke continues with the story. After they had completed the days of Passover, as they were returning, the boy Jesus remained behind in Jerusalem, but his parents did not know it. Now, the key here is Luke's choice of words, that Jesus remained in Jerusalem. That implies that it was Jesus' choice to stay in Jerusalem. It was not Mary and Joseph who left him behind. And that kind of gets us around the delinquent parent idea, that Jesus chooses to stay behind unbeknownst to Mary and Joseph, and they leave without him. Now, the story continues, as we know, in which They search for Jesus. They go back to Jerusalem. It takes them 3 days before they finally find him. And as we said, they find him in the temple, teaching and listening to the scribes and the rabbis. And now the story gets to be a little bit fun, which is where preachers play with it. Because Luke tells us at verse 48, when his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, "Son, why have you done this to us? Your father and I have been looking for you with great anxiety." And he said to them, "Why were you looking for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" Now, if you think about it, Luke captures the family dynamic quite well. When parents become anguished or anxious over the behavior of their children, who do they blame? The kid, right? "Why have you done this to us?" is what Mary says. It's Jesus' fault that Mary and Joseph experience the anguish that they have. And when parents turn and blame their children for causing their anguish, what do the kids do? They blame the parents. "Why were you looking for me? You should have known that I was here. If you were anguished, it's your fault, not mine." So as much as this may have been 2,000 years ago, I'm not so sure much has changed. But then here's the key to the whole passage. But after Jesus says, "Did you not know I must be in my Father's house?" they did not understand what he said to them. Now, this is kind of the curious part. Because after all, this is the same gospel, the gospel according to Luke, in which the angel Gabriel appears to Mary and says that she is to give birth to the Son of God, that he will be great and he will reign as forever. Mary and Joseph know this child is special. They know that God is a part of his life. They know that he is the Son of God. So after Jesus says, "Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house?" don't you think they would have gotten it? Why do they not understand? And it seems to me that this is the key to Luke's gospel. You see, understanding who Jesus is isn't just a matter of the head. It's not an intellectual proposition. All through Luke's gospel, Jesus will be teaching his family members, his disciples, the people he heals, the people he helps. All along, he will be teaching them. And yet, throughout the entire gospel, they fail to understand who he is. Because according to St. Luke, understanding who Jesus is requires that you know the whole story about Jesus. That you know not just that he can teach, not just that he can heal, not just that he can love, but that you know that he also must suffer and die and rise again. And not only must you know that, you need to experience that with him. You need to walk the walk with Jesus, to be able to be part of his healing and his teaching ministry, as well as to share his sufferings and death and resurrection. You see, only then can we begin to understand who Jesus is. And St. Luke is starting his whole gospel with that theme through Mary and Joseph. For as much as they might know in their heads who Jesus is, they really won't understand who he fully is until they know the whole story. And in fact, even then, we won't fully know who Jesus is until we are with him on the resurrection on the last day. You see, that's why it can be hard for parents who, like Mary and Joseph, teach their children the faith. And they bring them to church, and they pray with them at home, only to see all of that go away when their kids grow up and leave home. You know, it's important for us to share our faith with our children, but that's not enough to guarantee that they'll accept the faith. Because like everyone else, our children have to walk the walk with Jesus. They have to live him in their own lives. They have to choose to know who he is before they can understand how powerful faith in Jesus Christ can be. And it's the same dynamic that can go on in our homes where there are broken relationships among our family members. As human beings, we hurt each other. And as family members, we're particularly good at hurting each other. We know all the weaknesses, all the sensitivities, and all the failures. We know just what buttons to push to cause the most harm. So when we hear Jesus talk about forgiveness and love and kindness, we just can't wrap our minds around it. It just doesn't make any sense. But you see, if we're going to love and forgive and move on according to Jesus' word, then it has to come from walking the walk, from living our lives as Jesus did. Quite frankly, much of what Jesus says doesn't make any sense intellectually. It's only possible to follow it in faith, not because Jesus said so, but because we know the whole story and are willing to live by it. By the time Jesus was 12, Mary and Joseph knew a lot about him, but that didn't mean they understood everything about him. Like everyone else in Luke's gospel, they would have to wait for the whole story before they could understand it. So in the meantime, Luke tells us that Mary kept all of these things in her heart. That's a lot different from pondering them in her head. Because when we keep our faith in our head, when we just mull over things over and over in our thoughts, when we criticize and analyze and judge, we can't understand what God is up to. It's only when we approach them by pondering them in our hearts that we can begin to understand. Because we come at faith not so much from the perspective of reason, but from the perspective of love. We approach things lovingly, gently, patiently, and open to the providence of God. As St. John tells us in his first letter, it is by living the commandment of love that Jesus gave us that we know that he dwells within us. Because love changes our whole perspective. Despite what preachers might say about today's story of the Holy Family, I think Luke presents a dynamic in families that's still true for many of us today. We still need to pass our faith on to our children by teaching them and including them in religious customs. And the anguish parents can undergo when things go wrong with their children and their kids' seeming insensitivity to it all, that just continues as well. And the need for all family members to ponder the mysteries of God in their hearts, and to trust in God while understanding and faith grows over time is really what this story is about. We won't understand it all at once. We just need to keep with one another and with God, pondering what is happening in our hearts. Luke concludes his story today by saying that Jesus advanced in wisdom and age and favor before God and others. Jesus was raised in a family, not in the temple, like Samuel was in our first reading. And families can be tough places to live and to learn and to love. But if we all walk with Jesus and walk with one another in faith and love, then we too can advance in wisdom and age and favor before God and others. Amen.